Humans called them Special Forces. The Galactic already feared the veterans. Part 1. First Contact with the Wrong Humans. The desert was cold at 2 in the morning. The kind of cold that got into your bones and stayed there. The kind that made most people want to be anywhere else. But Staff Sergeant Dale Kowalski was not most people. And neither were the 6 soldiers running beside him through the dark Nevada sand. They had been on their feet for 19 hours. They had covered 41 miles. 3 of them had minor cuts from a wire obstacle they had crossed 2 hours back. And one of them, a quiet woman named Corporal Nina Vasquez, had taken a hard fall on a rocky slope an hour ago and simply gotten back up without saying a word. Her knee was bleeding through her pant leg. She had not slowed down once. Dale was leading the group up a low ridge when he saw the light. It was not the light of a helicopter or a flare. It was something else entirely. It came down slowly from the sky, a wide, pale glow that pressed the darkness back and made the sand look silver. It was completely silent. That was the first strange thing. The second strange thing was the shape of it, long and curved and unlike anything Dale had ever seen, and he had seen a lot of things in his life. He raised a closed fist. The team stopped instantly, without a sound, without a question. 6 people became completely still in the dark. Their breathing slowed. Their eyes moved to the light and stayed there. The craft settled onto the desert floor about 300 meters ahead of them. A ramp lowered from its side. Light spilled out from inside, warm and yellow, and 4 figures walked down the ramp in a line. They were tall, taller than any person Dale had ever stood next to, and thin in a way that looked wrong, like their bodies had been stretched. They wore smooth, dark suits and carried weapons that glowed faintly at the tips. This one moved differently, slower, more careful, the way someone moves when they want to appear unthreatening. It stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked out at the desert. Dale studied the situation for about 4 seconds. Then he spat into the sand, stood up straight, and walked toward them. His team followed without hesitation. Ambassador Vale of the Thrin Collective had prepared extensively for this moment. He had read every piece of data the Conclave's long-range probes had collected on the human species over the past 60 years. He had practiced his greeting in 17 different human languages. He had been told that humans, when frightened, could be unpredictable, so he had brought armed escorts to discourage any aggressive response. What he had not been told, and what no probe had ever properly captured, was what it looked and felt like to watch 7 humans in full combat gear walk out of total darkness toward you without any visible fear whatsoever. His escorts raised their weapons. The humans did not stop walking. Dale held up one hand in a gesture that was universal enough, open palm, nothing in it, and kept moving at the same unhurried pace. When he was close enough to see the ambassador's face clearly, he stopped and looked the tall alien up and down with the same flat, measuring expression he used when sizing up a new piece of terrain. "You need water?" Dale asked. Vale stared at him. His translation device processed the words and rendered them clearly. He had not expected that. He had expected screaming, or gunfire, or at minimum, some visible trembling. He looked at the other 6 humans. One of the men, a thick-shouldered sergeant named Lou Darden, was slowly chewing something and watching the alien escorts, the way a bored professional watches people who do not know what they are doing. A younger soldier, barely 23, was studying the alien spacecraft with the calm curiosity of someone looking at a mildly interesting car. The woman with the bleeding knee was standing with her weight evenly distributed, relaxed but ready, her eyes making a slow circuit of the landing zone. Vale's sensors were running automatic scans. He looked at the readout on his wrist display and felt the first real unease of the evening. Their heart rates were elevated, but not from fear. The data was clear about that. Elevated heart rates from sustained physical exertion, healed fractures across multiple bones in nearly every one of them, muscle density that was high, even by human standards, old scar tissue in places that told quiet stories about things that had happened to these people and had not stopped them. The woman, Nina Vasquez, had a resting heart rate of 44 beats per minute. Even now, after whatever they had been doing out in the dark, her biometrics were calmer than most species Vale had ever encountered in a standard diplomatic meeting. He cleared his throat and began his prepared greeting. Dale listened politely. He let the ambassador finish the whole thing, all the words about peaceful contact and mutual benefit, and the great family of galactic civilization. When it was done, he nodded once and asked if they were planning to stay long, because the unit had a resupply point to reach before dawn. Vale blinked. "You are not alarmed?" Dale thought about it. "Should I be?" One of the escorts shifted the grip on his weapon slightly. Lou Darden's eyes moved to the escort's hands, and then back to his own boots in about a quarter of a second. He did not change his expression. He did not say anything. But his weight had shifted just slightly, the way a person shifts when they have quietly made a decision and are waiting to see if it becomes necessary. The escort, who had been trained to read body language across dozens of species, felt something cold move through him, and took a small step back without quite knowing why. Dale exchanged a few more words with the ambassador and accepted a small communication device that would allow future contact. He examined it briefly, handed it to Nina without looking at her, and then told Vale that they had to keep moving. The humans turned and walked back into the desert dark. Within 30 seconds they were invisible again, swallowed by the night as completely as if they had never been there. Vale stood on the sand for a long moment. Then he climbed back up the ramp and sat down in his command chair and looked at the biometric data on his screen for a long time. He wrote his report carefully. He noted the lack of fear. He noted the physical data. He noted the quiet, unhurried professionalism, the way they had assessed every threat in the landing zone without appearing to do so, the way the one called Lou had clocked his escort's weapon and made a decision about it without anyone else in the group needing to be told. He wrote at the end, "These humans are either defective or they have sent their most broken specimens to meet us. I am not certain which possibility concerns me more. Recommend significant caution before proceeding." He filed the report and sat back in his chair. He did not sleep that night. 300 meters away, in the dark, Dale Kowalski and his team were already 2 miles out, moving through the cold desert toward their objective, talking quietly about nothing important. Nina had resecured the wrap on her knee. Lou had finished whatever he had been chewing. None of them mentioned the aliens again until they were back at base. There was a debrief to file, and then there was sleep to get, and then there was more training tomorrow. That was how it worked. That had always been how it worked. The desert was cold. They moved through it anyway. Humans called them Special Forces. The Galactic already feared the veterans. Part 2. The Offer and the Misunderstanding. 3 months after the night in the Nevada desert, the Galactic Conclave made its formal offer to humanity. It was delivered through proper channels by this point. There had been several more meetings, a great deal of translation work, and one very long week where every government on Earth tried to decide how to respond to the fact that they were not alone in the universe. Most people on Earth took the news in the way humans tend to take large and confusing things, with a period of loudness followed by a slow, grudging adjustment to the new reality. The offer itself was simple. Every species that joined the conclave was asked to contribute to the combined defense force. It was a tradition more than anything else, a gesture of membership. The conclave's senior military analysts did not expect much from new species in the first several decades. The galaxy was complicated, and warfare in it was technical and old, and new civilizations needed time to understand it. The conclave's representative delivered the offer at a summit in Geneva, and smiled warmly when he was done. He fully expected humanity to send a small group of their most decorated ceremonial soldiers, the kind with impressive uniforms and good posture, and have them stand in line at an orbital station somewhere, looking dignified, while senior species handled the actual work. What Earth sent instead was Captain Aaron Bryce. Aaron was 41 years old and had been in the Army for 22 years. He had deep-set eyes that were permanently calm in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. and he walked like a man who was always aware of exactly how much space he occupied, and exactly what was around him. He had been selected to lead a 12-person unit drawn from several different special operations backgrounds across 3 branches of the military. Among them was Sergeant First Class Lou Darden, who had been in the desert on the night of first contact, and who had a talent for looking completely harmless right up until the moment he wasn't. There was Staff Sergeant Priya Okafor, who had grown up in Houston and had a master's degree in mechanical engineering that she had earned during 2 deployments and never once mentioned to anyone unless it was directly useful. There was Corporal Dante Webb, who was 23 years old and had made it through selection faster than almost anyone in his group's history, and had responded to this achievement by becoming notably quieter rather than louder. There were 9 others, each one carrying a history of experiences that would have ended most people, and had instead simply made them harder to surprise. They arrived at Orbital Station Verath on a conclave transport ship after a journey of 2 days. The station was large and busy, and full of species from across the galaxy, many of whom stopped and stared at the humans as they moved through the docking corridor. This happened partly because humans were new and unusual, and partly because of something harder to name, something about the way the group moved through a crowded space that made other beings instinctively give them room without being asked. They did not walk like diplomats. They did not walk like ambassadors. They walked in a loose, quiet formation, with their eyes moving constantly, and the 2 at the back of the group periodically glanced behind them in a way that was completely natural and completely deliberate at the same time. By the time they reached the welcome hall, Priya and Lou had between them noted every exit, every potential choke point, and the 3 positions on the station that would give the best view of the docking area in an emergency. Neither of them said any of this out loud. They did not need to. Commander Zeeth received them in the welcome hall with genuine warmth. He was a senior conclave official of the Yethran species, tall, pale blue, with large eyes that shifted color slightly depending on his mood, which Aaron noted as a useful thing to know. Zeeth had overseen the integration of 11 new species into the Defense Force, and he was practiced at making newcomers feel comfortable. He explained the posting: ceremonial border patrol along the Kelthar neutral zone, quiet territory, mostly administrative, a good place to observe and learn how the conclave operated before taking on anything demanding. He expected the typical response: gratitude, nodding, an eagerness to please. Aaron listened to the full briefing without interruption. When Zeeth finished, Aaron thanked him and asked 3 questions. The first was about the patrol rotation schedule and whether it had been updated in the last 18 months. The second was about communication lag between the Kelthar zone and the nearest response fleet. The third was about the survey data on terrain features along the northern border section, specifically whether the conclave had full topographic mapping or only partial. Zeeth answered as best he could, and found midway through the third answer that he was not entirely sure of some of the details. He said he would have his staff follow up. Aaron nodded and thanked him again. That evening, Lou Darden sat in the quarters assigned to the unit, and spent 4 hours going through every piece of data the conclave had made available about the Kelthar zone. He had a notebook, an actual physical notebook, which several conclave staff members had looked at with open curiosity, and he filled 12 pages of it in his small, precise handwriting. By morning, he had a complete redesign of the patrol route. It addressed 17 tactical blind spots that the conclave's own analysts had not identified in 10 years of operating in the zone. He printed it out. The conclave system was compatible enough for that at least, and brought it to breakfast, where he set it on the table next to Aaron's coffee without ceremony. Aaron read through it while he ate. He made 2 small notes in the margin and slid it back. Lou took the paper to Commander Zeeth's office after breakfast and handed it across the desk with the same casual energy he might use handing someone a grocery list. Zeeth looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called in his senior intelligence officer and his chief patrol coordinator and they all looked at it together for a while. It took 3 days of verification. Every blind spot was real. Several of them had been flagged years ago by individual patrol officers, and then buried in reports no one had fully acted on. Lou had found them all in 4 hours, with a notebook and a clear head. Z sent a short message to Aaron after the verification was complete. It said only, "The analysis has been confirmed. I would like to speak with your unit more about their methods when time allows." Aaron replied that they were available any evening after training. Zeeth read this and paused for a moment. They were running their own training, on a posting he had specifically described as ceremonial and low demand. They had immediately set up a training schedule. He had not asked them to. No one had suggested it. They had simply done it because, as near as Zeeth could tell, that was what they did. He sat back in his chair and thought about the unit for a while. He thought about the way they moved through the station. He thought about the 3 questions Aaron had asked in the welcome hall, which had been, he now realized, exactly the 3 most tactically significant questions anyone could have asked about the Kael'thar posting. He had welcomed 11 species into the Defense Force. Not one of them had asked even one question like those in the first meeting. Most of them had just smiled and nodded and asked where the dining facilities were. He made a note in the unit's file. It was short. It said only, "Monitor closely. These are not what I expected." He meant it as a caution. Over the following months, he would realize it was also, in the most genuine sense, a compliment. In their quarters, the unit ran drills, reviewed maps, and planned. The galaxy stretched around them on all sides, full of things they had not seen yet. None of them were worried. Worried was not really something they did anymore. Tomorrow, they would begin their posting. They would do what they had always done. They would be ready. They were always ready. Humans called them Special Forces. The Galactic already feared the veterans. Part 3. The Incident at Kael'thar. The Kael'thar neutral zone was a stretch of rocky highland between 2 systems that neither side of an old border dispute had ever fully claimed. It was windy and dry, and the ground was the color of old rust. The Conclave had been running patrol routes through it for years without incident, and most of the officers assigned there considered it the quietest posting in the sector. The human unit had been there 6 weeks when the Vorath came. The Vorath Mercenary Guild was not an army in the traditional sense. They were hired. Someone somewhere had paid them to probe the neutral zone near a cluster of low-built structures that housed a small group of Shen refugees, a quiet people, non-combatant, who had been sheltering in the zone for the better part of 2 years after their home system was damaged in a dispute that had nothing to do with them. There were about 400 Shen in the settlement. None of them had weapons. None of them had anywhere to go quickly. The Vorath raiding party was 83 strong. They had combat vehicles, long-range scanning equipment, and pulse weapons that could cut through standard armor without difficulty. By any reasonable calculation, 83 armed Vorath against 400 unarmed Shen refugees was not a fight. It was a harvest. Standard Conclave protocol in a situation like this was clear. Non-combatants were to be moved away from the threat. A distress call was to be filed with the nearest response fleet. The response fleet would arrive and handle the situation. The expected arrival time was 9 hours. The Vorath would reach the settlement in 4. Aaron Bryce read the scan data on his handheld unit and then looked up at the highland terrain stretching out ahead of him. Rust-colored rock, narrow gullies, ridgelines that caught the wind and turned it loud. He thought for about 30 seconds and then turned to his unit. He said, 12 of us, 4 hours, 83 of them. Let's go. Nobody asked any questions. That was not a thing they did. He split them into 4 elements and gave each element a zone of responsibility. Lou Darden took the northern approach with 2 others. Priya Okafor went alone into a deep ravine that ran along the eastern edge of the Vorath advance route. Dante Webb and a soldier named Corporal Greg Salter took the high ground to the south. Aaron took the remaining 5 directly into the rocky middle ground between the Vorath and the settlement and started setting up. Commander Zeeth received the notification alert 40 minutes later and immediately broke protocol by ordering the response fleet to accelerate their departure. He would explain the breach of procedure later. At the time, he simply could not make himself wait. What happened over the next 97 minutes was recorded on 3 conclave sensor arrays positioned around the Kael'thar zone. The recordings were later reviewed 41 times by military analysts, twice by the Conclave Intelligence Directorate, and once in a closed session by the full Senior Council. People kept watching them, not because they could not understand what had happened, but because even after they understood it, it still looked like something that should not have been possible. The Vorath advance column entered the highland terrain and immediately began losing cohesion. The ground seemed to work against them. Vehicles got channeled into narrow paths by rocky formations and found those paths blocked or turned. Small groups moving to scout ahead stopped moving and did not come back. Communications between Vorath elements started breaking down. Their relay equipment went offline at a point in the ravine where no one should have been able to reach it without being seen. Priya Okafor had reached it in the dark of a dry stream bed, done what needed to be done, and rejoined her element without a sound. The Vorath commanders tried to consolidate. They pulled their forces into a tighter formation. They were experienced mercenaries, and they knew the feeling of being picked apart from the edges. So they brought everyone together and moved as a mass, which is what you do when you cannot find your enemy. The problem was that a tight formation in that terrain meant predictable movement. Predictable movement meant that Aaron's element, watching from 3 separate elevated positions, knew exactly where the Vorath were going before the Vorath got there. Dante Webb had been sitting behind a rock on the southern ridge for 40 minutes when the Vorath flanking group came up through a narrow cut below him. There were 11 of them. They were moving fast and confident because they had swept this area 20 minutes ago and found nothing. Dante had been there the whole time, simply staying still in a way that a lot of beings find impossible, but that had been trained into him so deeply, it was just another thing his body knew how to do. He held that position alone for 11 minutes with a sidearm and the terrain. When Greg Salter arrived at his position, the cut below them was no longer a concern. By the time the Vorath commanders fully understood what was happening, their force of 83 had been reduced by half, and the remaining members were scattered across 3 kilometers of highland, with no communications, no clear route forward, and no reliable picture of where the threat was coming from. The Vorath were trained fighters. They were not afraid easily. But there is a particular quality to an enemy you cannot see, and cannot locate, and cannot stop. And it does something to the clearest professional mind if it goes on long enough. It went on long enough. The response fleet came in 4 hours early, which meant 5 hours ahead of the standard protocol window. Commander Zeeth was on the lead ship, and he had the visual feed up on his screen before they broke atmosphere, trying to understand what the sensor data was telling him. What the sensor data was telling him was that it was over. They landed outside the Shen settlement. The wind was coming down off the ridges, carrying dust. Zeeth walked down the ramp and stopped. The 12 humans were sitting on the ground near the settlement entrance. Some of them were eating. 2 of them were talking quietly. One of them, Lou Darden, had his boot off and was examining his ankle with a mildly irritated expression. The Shen refugees were still inside their structures, but some of them had come to the doors and windows and were watching the humans with wide, dark eyes. The Vorath were in the open ground to the north, all of them. What was left of the force, bound and arranged in organized rows as though someone had taken the time to sort them by size. Zeeth walked toward Aaron Bryce and stopped a few feet away. He did not know what to say for a moment. He looked at the rows of Vorath, and then at the 12 humans, and then at the scan readout on his wrist that confirmed no Shen casualties and no structural damage to the settlement. He asked, very quietly, how many of Aaron's people had been hurt. Aaron looked over his shoulder at his unit. He thought about it for half a second. Lou twisted his ankle in a drainage ditch, he said. He'll be fine. Zeeth stood there for another long moment. The wind moved through the highland and pulled dust across the ground between them. He looked at Lou, who was putting his boot back on with the focused attention of a man dealing with a minor inconvenience. He looked back at Aaron and found he had nothing to say that was adequate. So he said nothing. He simply nodded once slowly, the way someone nods when they have just understood something that changes the shape of things. The debriefs would take 3 days. The reports would take longer. The questions from the senior council would take longer still. But standing there in the rust-colored dust outside the Shen settlement with the wind in his ears, Zeeth was already past all of that. He had sent these 12 people to the quietest posting in the sector. He had called it ceremonial. He had thought he was doing them a kindness by giving them something easy to start with. He understood now, with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable, that there was no such thing as an easy posting for people like this. Not because they made everything harder, but because wherever they were simply and completely ready for whatever came. That, he was beginning to understand, was what made them extraordinary. Not the capability alone, the readiness, the constant, quiet, total readiness, like water that is always all ready at the temperature it needs to be. He turned and walked back to his ship to begin the debrief, and thought about that word for a long time. Ready. Such a small word for such a large thing. Humans called them Special Forces. The Galactic already feared the veterans. Part 4. What the Galactic learned, and what they had not known to ask. The recordings from the Kael'thar zone spread through conclave channels the way a small fire spreads when the wind picks up, faster than expected, and in more directions than anyone planned. Within 2 weeks, the sensor footage had been requested by 14 separate military divisions, 3 xenobiological research bodies, and at least 2 intelligence agencies that had asked politely and then helped themselves when the request took too long. The footage itself was not dramatic in the way that most beings expected combat footage to be. There were no great explosions, no dramatic open charges, no visible moments of clear heroism that a viewer could point to and say, "There, that is the moment." What the footage showed instead was a slow, systematic, almost quiet process of a larger force being taken apart piece by piece by an enemy it could never quite locate. It was like watching someone untie a knot from the inside, and for most species watching it, the most unsettling thing was not what they saw. It was how little they saw. 12 people had done this, and the censors had barely caught them doing it. The debate about what the footage meant went on for weeks in military circles. The tactical logic, once fully analyzed, was learnable. The individual decisions made sense once they were broken down step by step. Senior conclave strategists could follow the reasoning and agree, in retrospect, that each choice had been correct. What they could not fully explain was how 12 beings had made all those correct choices simultaneously, under pressure, in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain, against a force 7 times their number, without a single communications breakdown, without a single element acting out of coordination, without hesitation. Someone in the Intelligence Directorate eventually put the question plainly in a written report. The tactics are understandable. What is not understandable is the people who executed them. We need to understand the people. That report led to the research delegation. The delegation arrived on Earth 6 weeks after Kael'thar. There were 9 of them from 4 different species. Biologists, behavioral researchers, a military historian from the Yethron Academy, and 2 intelligence analysts who wore civilian clothes and did not give their full institutional affiliations. They were given full access to several human military training programs, with the polite but clear understanding that anything they observed was voluntary on humanity's part, and that certain specific programs and locations would remain restricted. They spent 14 days watching. On the 3rd day, they observed a selection course. This was the process by which humans chose who would be allowed to train for special operations roles. They watched candidates Men and women already considered to be among the most physically capable people in their military carry loads of over 40 kilograms through mountain passes in cold rain. They watch them navigate without instruments, solve complex logistics problems while being shouted at, work together in small groups where they had known each other for only days, and fail repeatedly, and get back up and continue. The Thrin biologist on the delegation, a careful and experienced researcher named Dr. Aveth, who had spent 30 years studying the behavioral patterns of 31 species under stress, watched all of this with great attention. She had her scanner running constantly. She was building a detailed profile of human stress response, pain tolerance, and recovery patterns. What she found was consistently surprising. Human pain tolerance was high, but not uniquely so among galactic species. What was unusual was the relationship between pain and function. Most species showed a clear and predictable decline in cognitive performance as physical distress increased. Humans showed this too, but the curve was different. It flattened much later and dropped much more slowly. They could think clearly at levels of physical suffering that would have reduced most species to pure survival instinct. They had, as she wrote in her notes, an unusual capacity to remain themselves under pressure. On the 7th day, the delegation visited a training base and was introduced to Master Sergeant Glenn Ferris, who ran selection assessments for one of the more demanding programs. Glenn was 53 years old and had the kind of quiet, unhurried manner that comes from a long time spent in difficult places. He was polite to the delegation and answered their questions without performance or pride, the way a craftsman discusses their trade. Aveth asked him what the selection process was designed to find. She expected an answer about physical capability, or intelligence, or perhaps aggression. Glenn thought for a moment and said, "We already know they're strong when they get here. We're finding out who keeps going when strong isn't enough." Dr. Aveth wrote this down. She flagged it in her notes with a mark she reserved for statements that required extended analysis. Later, in her final report to the Conclave Research Board, she would call it the single most alarming statement she had recorded from any species in 30 years of xenological fieldwork. Not because it was violent or threatening, but because of what it assumed about normal limits, and the casual ease with which it described a system designed to locate people for whom those limits did not apply in the standard way. But it was not the selection process that disturbed the delegation most deeply. It was the veterans. On the 9th day, they spent time with a unit that had returned from active deployment 6 months earlier. These were not young soldiers new to the work. These were people who had been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. People who had seen the full weight of what their profession involved and had been through it not once, but many times. In most species, this accumulation of difficult experience produced visible effects: increased anxiety response, elevated base-level threat perception, a conservative and defensive behavioral shift. The body and mind learned caution from hard experience and carried that caution forward. The humans in this unit were not cautious. They were not anxious. They were not broken or dulled or distant in the way that suggested damage going unaddressed. They were, by every behavioral measure Dr. Aveth could apply, more precise and more settled than younger soldiers with less experience. They moved and spoke with an economy that came from knowing exactly what was necessary and having long ago discarded everything that was not. Their threat assessment was fast and accurate, but it was not hair-trigger. They simply knew, with a depth of experience that had become part of how they existed, exactly how to recognize it and exactly what to do when they found it. One of the veterans, a woman named Sergeant Major Carol Diaz, who had been in service for 24 years and had a face that was calm the way deep water is calm, sat with Dr. Aveth for an hour and answered questions about her experience. She spoke plainly and without drama about things that would have required significant processing from most beings just to listen to. She was not numb. That was what made it remarkable. She still cared about everything she described. She had simply found a place to carry it that did not slow her down. Dr. Aveth asked her, near the end of the hour, whether she found the work difficult. Carol considered the question honestly. It was, she said, for a long time. Now it's just what I know how to do. That evening, Dr. Avitz sat in her room at the research facility and tried to write up her notes, and found that she kept stopping. She was a professional and a scientist, and she was not given to emotional responses that interfered with her work. But she sat for a long time with her hands still, and thought about what she had seen over the past 14 days. Every species the Conclave had encountered responded to accumulated trauma by becoming more careful, more defended, more pulled back from risk. It was a logical and nearly universal response. The nervous system learned from damage and tried to prevent more of it. This was the pattern across dozens of different biologies and dozens of different civilizations. The humans had found another way. Not all of them, and not easily, and not without cost. She understood that clearly. But the ones who came through the full process, who survived the selection and the training and the years and the weight of everything the work asked of them, came out the other side, not more defended, but more capable, not more fearful, but more clear. She had no clinical word for this in her own language. The concept did not exist in her field's taxonomy. She spent 2 days after returning from Earth trying to find an adequate term in any of the 37 languages she had working knowledge of. In the end, she used the human's own word. She wrote in her final report, "The most significant finding is not capability. The most significant finding is that the humans have a system, long, expensive, painful, and deliberately designed, for producing people who are, in the most precise and non-metaphorical sense of the term, unbreakable. Not invulnerable, not immune to harm, but structurally, functionally, and characterologically resistant to being stopped by it." She paused before writing the last line. Then she wrote it. The Conclave should understand clearly what this means. They are not training soldiers. They are building something else. And they have been doing it for a very long time. Humans called them Special Forces. The Galactic already feared the veterans. Part 5. The New Arrangement. The Galactic Conclave had been operating for 417 years. In that time it had welcomed 29 species into full membership, overseen 12 major border resolutions, managed 1 catastrophic war and 2 smaller ones, and built a body of law and procedure so thorough and layered that understanding it fully was the work of a lifetime. It was not a body that moved quickly. It was not designed to. Patience was its greatest institutional quality, and most of its members considered that a virtue. The emergency session called to discuss humanity's reclassification was scheduled 18 months after the night in the Nevada desert. It was the fastest a reclassification motion had ever reached the full council floor. The previous record had been 11 years. Commander Zeeth had submitted the motion himself. This was also unusual. Senior officials did not typically introduce reclassification motions. That was administrative work, the job of lower committees. But Zeeth had written the motion personally and submitted it through his own authority. And when the procedural committee had quietly suggested that it might be more appropriate for him to pass it to the standard channel, he had looked at them with the measured patience of someone who had watched 12 humans dismantle 83 mercenaries in 4 hours, and said that he believed his time was better spent on this directly. The committee had not pushed back. The session convened in the main chamber at Orbital Station Verith, the same station where Aaron Bryce's unit had first arrived, with their quiet eyes and their physical notebooks. The chamber was large and tiered, and held representatives from all 29 member species. Most of them had read Zeeth's motion. Many of them had seen Dr. Avitz's report. All of them had access to the Kael'thar sensor recordings, though not all of them had watched more than once. Zeeth presented the motion clearly and without embellishment. He had always been a plain speaker, and he saw no reason to change that here. He laid out the facts in order. First contact in the Nevada desert, and the biometric profile of the 7 humans encountered. The arrival at Verith, and the behavior of the unit in their first days, including Lou Darden's patrol route analysis. The incident at Kael'thar, and the full sensor data. Dr. Avitz's research delegation findings. And then, in the final section of his presentation, a separate analysis that his own intelligence staff had quietly assembled over the previous 3 months. An assessment not of what this particular unit could do, but of how many people on Earth had gone through comparable training. The number was significantly larger than most of the chamber had assumed. He did not editorialize. He simply presented the figure, let the chamber sit with it for a moment, and then said that in his professional judgment, the combined defense force was carrying one of its most significant assets in a category designed for ceremonial postings, and that this served neither humanity nor the conclave. The motion called for full operational autonomy for human special operations units in crisis situations, the authority to act without waiting for conclave authorization when circumstances required it. It was a level of independent authority that no species had ever been granted in fewer than 2 centuries of membership. Every previous case had required decades of demonstrated reliability, political negotiation, and gradual trust building through small incremental steps. Zeeth was proposing to skip all of that. There was debate. Some of it was substantive. Genuine questions about oversight, about the limits of autonomous authority, about how the policy would function in ambiguous situations, where the definition of crisis was unclear. Zeeth answered these carefully and in good faith. He had anticipated them and had prepared responses that were thorough without being dismissive. Some of the debate was more cautious in a different way, a hesitation that was harder to articulate, but that several speakers circled around in different words. It was the feeling that comes from being in a room where the discussion is moving towards something whose full implications are not yet entirely clear. Not bad implications necessarily, just large ones. One of the Thrin Council members who had read Dr. Aveth's report several times put it plainly near the end of the session. She said that she did not oppose the motion. She said she understood the tactical logic entirely. But she wanted it noted in the record that the conclave was, in passing this motion, formally acknowledging something it had spent the past 18 months slowly coming to understand in full. That humanity's military, and in particular, the specific category of human warrior they had been observing, was not a supplement to the combined defense force. She paused. The chamber was quiet. "It is a different kind of thing entirely," she said, "and we should be clear with ourselves about that." The vote was taken. There were no dissenting votes. The motion passed. The formal notification was transmitted to Earth that evening. The Vorath Mercenary Guild received the news through their own intelligence channels approximately 48 hours later. Within 72 hours, 3 outstanding contracts in conclave-adjacent space had been quietly withdrawn. No official reason was given for any of them. No explanation was offered or requested. The contracts simply disappeared from the active register, and the Vorath representatives involved did not return communications about them. The withdrawal was noted in a conclave intelligence summary and filed without additional comment. The analyst who wrote the entry was economical. She noted the timing, noted the absence of explanation, and left the interpretation to the reader. She had been in intelligence work for 20 years and knew that sometimes the most meaningful thing in a document was what it did not need to say. On Earth, the reclassification made the second page of most major newspapers. It was not front-page material for most outlets. There were other things happening in the world, and the story, while significant to people who understood what it meant, required a degree of context that made it easy for editors to slide it back a few pages. A few defense journalists wrote pieces that captured the weight of it. Most general coverage kept it short. Aaron Bryce read the notification brief on a Tuesday morning in the small office he used at the training base where his unit had returned 3 weeks earlier. He read it twice, made a single note in the margin, and then forwarded it to his unit with 1 line of text attached. The line said, FYI. Lou Darden read the forward during a break between training blocks and passed his phone to Priya Okafor without saying anything. She read it and passed it back and went back to the work she had been doing. Lou put his phone away and finished the rest of his water. Dante Webb had caught the motion of the phone being passed and looked over. He asked what it said. Aaron was sitting against the far wall with a coffee going cold in his hand and the same settled, unhurried expression he wore most of the time. He looked at Dante for a moment. "They figured out what we are," he said. Dante thought about this. It was not a long silence, but it was a real one. Then he asked whether that changed anything. Aaron looked out through the open doorway at the range where the next group of candidates was already moving in the early morning heat. They were 40 minutes into a run that would last another 3 hours, and from where he sat, he could see 2 of them helping a third one up a slope. Nobody had told them to do that. They just did it, because that was what you did. He had been watching things like that for 20 years. Young people finding out what they were capable of, and then finding out that the answer was more than they had thought. It never got old. He hoped it never would. He looked back at Dante. "Not for us," he said. The morning moved on. The training rotation continued. Glenn Ferris walked across the courtyard outside with a clipboard and a cup of coffee and nodded at Aaron through the doorway without breaking stride. Somewhere across the base, someone was running a time trial. Somewhere else, someone was failing a problem set and being told to try again. Across 400 light-years of space, in a conclave intelligence archive on orbital station Verith, Dr. Avith was updating the file she had first opened the night Ambassador Vale filed his initial report from the Nevada desert. The file had gone through 4 classification changes in 18 months. It had started as a curiosity, become a concern, become a serious study, and was now something that didn't fit neatly into any single category her filing system had. She thought about the veterans she had spent time with on Earth. Carol Diaz, and the others like her. People who had carried the full weight of what their work asked, and had come through it, not smaller, but more themselves. She thought about Dante Webb, who was 23 years old, and had already learned to be still in a way that most beings twice his age never managed. She thought about Lou Darden passing a 12-page tactical analysis across a breakfast table like it was nothing. She thought about Aaron Bryce answering questions in a welcome hall with the 3 most tactically precise questions anyone had ever asked in that room, and about the total absence of performance in how he did it. She had spent her career studying what made species what they were. She believed in precision. She did not like labels that were too broad to be useful. But she had sat with this particular file for long enough now, had turned it over enough times, that she knew what the right word was. She had known it for a while. She had just been checking her work. She changed the classification on the file. The old label, the one that Vale had written the night it was created, defective specimens, recommend caution, disappeared. The new label was a single word, borrowed from the human's own language. She had come to believe it was the most honest and accurate thing she could say about what she had observed, and she was a person who valued honesty and accuracy above almost everything else. She typed it in, saved the file, and closed her screen. The word was dangerous. Not as a warning, though it was that too, but in the deeper, more precise sense that she had spent 18 months arriving at. The sense in which a thing that is fully and completely what it was built to be is always, in some fundamental way, dangerous to anything that does not understand it. The conclave now understood it. She thought that was probably a good thing,